started by giving an introduction into the matrix demonstration project and the matrix, and talk about a couple of demonstrations that we're focusing on. I guess I want to start by saying that, to me, evidence-based policing is not just about the supply of research. It's not just about academics doing the research in policing. It's really about the use of research in practice. And so getting research translated, institutionalized, and used in practice, if it helps the police, is something that I think is really the other half of evidence-based policing, and it's very important to think about. The often lamented gap between practice and between research is certainly not new, but I think as democracies advance, there's definitely a push to reduce this gap. And certainly this is the case in policing in the last couple of decades, in the leadership and the grants that you're seeing coming out. The attempt to reduce that gap has been an effort that we see more and more today. So the main question of the matrix demonstration project, therefore, is really focused on how might the police take information that we already have. There's decades of research, literally, that we have on policing. How might they take this information and institutionalize it into daily practice? Is it something that should be institutionalized into daily practice? This is another important question that we need to think about. And how does this actually happen? And when I say research, although I tend to focus a lot on crime control research, I'm including a wide range of different types of research in this area. Police legitimacy, use of force, racial profiling. I mean, you name it, there's research on all sorts of different things. Karen Amendela, where's Karen? Karen has just finished a study on shift work. And so a lot of this represents research that's already out there. The question is, how can we leverage it for the police to take advantage of it in their practice? I always like to start with this because I think Sherman's discussion of evidence-based policing is right on point. It really sets us up for this notion of research being about use, not just about generation of research. And when he wrote about it in 1998 for the Ideas in American Policing lecture for the Police Foundation, he said that police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. And what he was talking about here was two types of scientific evidence. One, evaluation evidence, so research on what works in policing and on interventions, outcome evaluations. And the second piece of information is analysis that comes from within the police department. So crime analysis, analysis on data related to management or supervision, whatever, right? He was talking about both scientific evidence inside and outside of the police agency, having an impact on tactical, strategic, and managerial issues in police agencies. So while evidence-based policing definitely emphasizes the quality of research, because it certainly does, evidence-based crime policy is about improving the quality of research that we supply, it also means improving the use of research in practice. I'd like to expand, though, a little bit on this notion of evidence-based policing, because I think when we think about translating research into practice, when we think about the Matrix Demonstration Project, we need to have a little bit more of a more expanded definition of this term. To me, the relationship between police research and practice really means three things. First, that policies and practices reflect crime prevention principles derived from rigorous research. They do not have to match exactly a research study on problem-oriented policing in Kansas City, okay? But at least it needs to reflect the principles that are derived from rigorous research, and I'll be going through some of these principles that we know about in a minute. It also implies that some decisions include and incorporate knowledge from research and scientific processes, that some decisions. There are some critics of evidence-based policing that say, well, you want researchers to run the police department. No, you definitely don't want researchers to run the police department. I mean, crime would be rampant, probably. But at least that some decisions incorporate and include knowledge from research and scientific processes, again, from both in and outside of agencies. And finally, that research and analysis is at least a part of the conversation when police practitioners strategize about crime prevention, okay? So for example, in CompStat meetings, is the knowledge of research and practice at least present somehow? And what would that look like? And why would you even want to do that, okay? So these are questions I think we have to tackle with evidence-based policing. I think the expanded definition has a few more nuances that need to be said. One, that research on its own, the supply of research on its own cannot achieve evidence-based policing. Why? Because evidence-based policing is about the demand for research from law enforcement agencies and how that supply meets that demand for research. And I would argue that there are two things that make this happen, and this is really what today's discussions are going to be about. The two things that help meet supply and demand of research in policing are, I'm sorry, I don't know if you all can see this, but translating research into practical applications and also institutionalizing its use in regular operations. So translating tools and institutionalization processes are really needed in order to actually take abstract ideas from research. For example, crime concentrates at hotspots. Okay? Well, what does that look like to a patrol officer that's driving around in their car? Right? What does that mean to that patrol officer? And translating that research and institutionalizing it into regular operations is very much a part of evidence-based approaches. Now, we initially developed the evidence-based policing matrix to work on the first part, which is the translation part. Okay? We're thinking, all right, there's 120 rigorous studies of police interventions out there. Obviously, police officers and commanders, they do not have the time, nor do researchers sometimes have the time to actually read hundreds and thousands of pages of these things and somehow bring them all together into some kind of organization. And so we created the matrix in order to do this easily. And this is a free tool that's available online. And this matrix then led us to think about, okay, now we've got the matrix, now we've pulled together some of these principles. How does this actually turn into everyday activities of the police? And that's what the Matrix Demonstration Project is about. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Matrix, it's a free online tool. You can just go to the center's website. Anybody can access it. For the researchers in this room, if you'd like to just download the entire data behind the Matrix, that's also available. Just right online, you can do that, so you can see how we code it. Everything is transparent. But the Matrix is a tool on our website. It houses all police crime control research that reaches at least a medium level of scientific rigor, and some studies which are highly rigorous. Today, I'm just going to give you the punchline of the Matrix, rather than go through and tell you how we developed it. That is available if you want to see that on a video from last year. Okay. So the evidence-based policing matrix, let me give you kind of a quick overview. There are about 120 police evaluations there are 120 evaluations on police interventions that reach a medium level of scientific rigor, meaning that we have some certainty that we can believe the results of those studies. Okay? And what we did was we simply it's actually just a simple tool. We color-coded the studies by whether they were successful or they did not show a successful outcome. We then organized them in terms of what their targets were, whether the intervention was proactive or reactive, whether the intervention was focused or not focused, and we mapped them into our three-dimensional tool by these axes of target, level of proactivity, and focused or not focused. And we did this for every single study in policing that's out there that reaches a certain level of rigor on crime control. Okay? And on the matrix demonstration, on the I don't want to deviate from this screen, but if you go to our website, you can actually click onto each one of these dots and see a short abstract of the study, what it found, or you can click on, and in your workbooks, we also put the slabs. We call them slabs. But you can see like individual slab, place-based slab. So everything is organized in these very quick statements about what the intervention was, whether or not it was successful, and just a little bit about what it was about. Okay? If you wanted to see the full study, we give the citations so you can go to the full studies as well. Okay? And what you start seeing with this mapping of these studies are what we call clustering or realms of effectiveness. So you start seeing clusterings of studies, and the black dot studies are the ones that were successful interventions. Okay? And what the clustering tells you is roughly something about the intersection of the three dimensions of the matrix that that clustering is, that you see the clustering located in. For example, we can take a look at this clustering up here. And so by this grouping of studies, which actually isn't too promising, there are some promising ones, there are some that didn't work, there are actually some that backfired, that made people worse. Okay? And that is in the individual, reactive, and focused area of the matrix. What does this mean? This means that from the totality of police research, we know that interventions that police use that are focused on individuals, that are reactive, and even if they're focused or tailored, may not be as effective, okay, as interventions that are focused on very small places, that are highly proactive, and that are also focused. Okay? So the matrix, you can see individual studies and you can see generalizations from the studies. And from this, crime prevention principles start emerging. Okay? Why do we think this is so important? Because agencies cannot copy exactly, like Richmond is not going to go and copy exactly what Kansas City does and then replicate it in their own agency. It doesn't work that way, right? But some of the principles that are gleaned from research can be very valuable when Richmond is deciding how to deal with gun crime in Sector 4, okay? So what do we know from the research? Well, we know that officers can be much more successful when they are proactive rather than reactive. And I'm going to go through each one of these in a minute. We also know that officers can be more effective when they focus or tailor their strategies and tactics to problems at hand. And finally, and by the way, this is probably not new to anybody, any of these principles, okay? And finally, it tells us that officers can be very effective if they focus on places, not just people, okay? So in other words, if we are proactive, if we focus on places, if we are tailored in our strategies, we can have a much better effect in terms of crime prevention according to the totality of what we know from the research. Okay? The interesting thing is that most police strategies are what? Reactive, general, and focused on individuals. Okay? So this is the crux of the difficulty, right? And which is the fun part, it's the challenge, right? So if we're having a meeting, for example, in Comstat about gun crime, right? We're much better off coming up with a solution that is proactive, place-based, and focused, as opposed to one that is reactive, arrest-based, and focused generally on individuals. Okay? That's what I mean by kind of crime prevention common principles. Let me just go through these briefly before we get to some of the demonstrations. In terms of proactivity, an officer who believes that his or her job focuses around arrest and responding to calls for service is more likely going to be less effective than an officer that does not have this kind of mentality alone. Why? Because we know between 40 to 80% of an officer's time, a patrol officer's time, even in places that are high crime areas, and this might even be more of the case in places with medium and lower crime, that 40 to 80% of the time is not committed to anything. It is not answering calls, it's not making arrests. Okay? It might not even include driving to the call. Okay? That is a big chunk of time. I like to call this the officer's gold. This is the golden time. Because what officers do during this time is what matters in terms of crime reduction. It's not what they're doing when they're answering calls for service or when they're making arrests only. Okay? So proactivity, it also means anticipating crime, disorder, and other problems before they happen using crime analysis. In a couple of weeks, I'm addressing the International Association of Crime Analysts, and I basically have one statement, that crime analysts are absolutely central to evidence-based approaches. Absolutely. I am absolutely certain of that. And that's a hard thing to say as an academic, but I am certain of it. Okay, so they're absolutely essential. Why? Because proactivity requires this type of work and analysis to be done. It also means addressing the cause of crime patterns, not just addressing single crime incidents. Okay? Officers can be more effective when they are focused or tailored to actions more focused and they tailor their actions to problems at hand. Okay? For example, fights that occur in bars on Friday nights. These aren't simply coincidences that officers respond to. The frequency, the location of fights, it's directly related to the management of the bar, the security provided, the environment surrounding the bar, whether or not there's a parking lot behind the bar that people hang out in after the bar closes. All of these things contribute to the problem. And having a tailored approach is much better, is much more effective. And finally, from the many studies in policing that we know about, we know that a place-based approach is much more effective than only focusing on individuals. Okay? Officers who patrol crime hotspots have a greater effect than officers who randomly patrol their beats. Usually, the concentration of crime is something like 50% of an agency's crime probably takes place in less than 5% of their entire jurisdiction. Okay? And for those of you who police suburban and rural areas, the concentration might even be higher. Okay? So 50% might actually occur in less than 1% of the jurisdiction's locations. Where's Julie Hibden? Julie over here is from Southern Illinois University, and she's doing work on this particular area about the concentrations of crime in rural and suburban areas. So officers who are more attuned to places, policing places, and not just people, are more likely to have a positive effect in terms of crime reduction. Okay? So these principles, proactive, focused, place-based, we know they are clear characteristics of interventions that have a greater likelihood of effectiveness. Okay? The million-dollar question, though, is how do we get these things into practice? And I'm talking just everyday practice of the patrol officer. Having been an officer myself in Baltimore City, I know how difficult this is, right? Because we get into a habit about reacting to the radio, answering calls, running from one call to another, making arrests. We get into these habits, following standard operating procedures. And this kind of transition to proactive place-based focus is something that is almost opposite of what we're trained to do. It's definitely opposite of the standard operating procedures, that's for sure. Okay? It's not, I shouldn't say it's not opposite, but it's not included in there. Okay? And I would argue that it's not about tradition, it's not about officer mentality, it's deeper than that. Officer mentality is created by the systems of policing that are created by the standard operating procedures of policing, okay, and by what we think law enforcement is about. Okay? So I say all of that because I think, I say all of that because I think that as we move forward in thinking about how to be more proactive place-based focus, it's going to require converting systems in policing in order to institutionalize knowledge into everyday practices and make it, in a sense, second nature. Okay? And the Matrix Demonstration Project really focuses on these everyday systems. Okay? It's not about some special project, some ad hoc project. It's about focusing on the everyday systems of policing. We have demonstrations in professional development, academy and field training, which I'm going to talk about today. In deployment, patrol and investigations, Dr. Coper is going to focus a little bit on that. On accountability systems, promotions, we didn't have time to go through everything today, but we have demonstrations on accountability systems, promotions, assessment, management and leadership, CompStat, planning, research, and crime analysis. All of these are the regular systems of the police that need to be looked at if the police agency feels that it wants to take on this evidence-based policing agenda. There are 3 guiding principles we follow in the Matrix Demonstration Project. One is that the projects focus on creating permanent change by converting existing infrastructure. What do I mean by this? We're not developing some specialized project inside of a specialized unit that they assign their community-oriented officer to work on when they're not working on anything else. Okay? That is not what we're focused on. And I think that's what a lot of projects and partnerships between researchers and police agencies sometimes look like. Right? It's extremely specialized, it's ad hoc, and it's focused on specialized projects. Secondly, each project is anchored by good quality research, but it might not be visible. These are not interventions that we're not evaluating in the Matrix Demonstration Project. We're just creating examples on what this would look like if we implemented research into practice. And finally, we believe in the Matrix Demonstration, that the Matrix Demonstration Project has to have materials that the police can access for free. Okay? So everything that we create is just placed online that anybody can use. This includes academy curriculum. This includes something called Case of Place, which you're going to hear about today. So everything that we have is just freely available in terms of our demonstrations. So just to close today, I'm going to give you an idea of 2 of these demonstrations that we're working on with Baltimore City and Alexandria Police Departments. And then I'll turn over the mic to Chris, who's going to talk about Case of Place. The academy training, so demonstrations on academy training. I think that if we believe that being proactive, being focused, being place-based are important principles in crime prevention, it seems obvious this is something we would want to teach in the academy. Okay? And so the most logical demonstration, in my view, of incorporating research into the academy would be to actually teach these principles in the academy. Now this, I think, in theory is an interesting approach. We actually visited some academies, and this is not something that regularly occurs in academies. If you did a survey of all the academies in the United States, I would be surprised if you found many of them teaching about how to be place-based, how to be focused, and how to be proactive. Okay? It's almost, they might talk about it informally, but it's not taught in a formal way. Why? Well, there's actually many simple reasons why this is the case. Academies focus on procedures. They focus on teaching law. They focus on teaching administrative aspects of policing, driving, using the radio, knowing your 10 codes. Do they still use 10 codes nowadays? I was in a police car the other day, and nobody was on the radio, and I said, "What, is the radio down?" And they said, "No, we get everything now on our mobile computer units," which was kind of different. I don't know, from when I used to be in patrol. But the focus is much more on procedural issues and on these administrative aspects. And let me also say that innovations in policing rarely make it to the academy. You hear a lot of discussion about it in CompStat, you hear a lot of discussion about it at the managerial levels and maybe in the specialized units levels, but you rarely see it trickle down to the academies. Okay? Some of the main challenges that we found were that academies seem to be resource, knowledge, and system constrained. However, they're also flexible in the types of things that they might be able to do and change. So In terms of a demonstration in the academy, it seems that 4 things are required. One, that principles of effective policing must be taught. So we have to first acknowledge that these things have to be taught. And we have to come to grips with that because it's not being taught in American academies. Secondly, more importantly, these modules have to look like other modules. They have to fit into the hour slots that happen in the academy. They have to have learning objectives. They have to have assessment questions and study guides. And they have to be at the level of the entry-level officer. Okay? They can't be like what I'm talking about now. It has to be really broken down into the level of the officer and what would this look like on the street. It also, 3 is a little bit controversial, but I don't believe knowledge can be sold. This is why we have free symposiums. It needs to be freely available, and it has to be legitimate. Okay? The sources have to be legitimate. The knowledge has to be freely available. And it needs to be, why? Because the academy is not necessarily going to purchase this information. It's hard to find an expert that knows about evidence-based policing that's going to come to your academy every class and teach this material. It's very hard. It's just almost as hard as finding someone to teach self-defense, and you have all these contractors and things like that. So that's why I argue number 3, this is really important in policing, or else it's not going to happen. And finally, number 4, there needs to be concrete examples for the entry-level officer. What does focused policing, tailored policing, proactive policing, place-based policing, what does that mean to an officer when they get into that patrol car and start patrolling their neighborhood? Okay? What are some tangible examples that they can use? Okay. So what did we do for this demonstration? We just went ahead and created a module. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to release this to anybody who wants to use it. It's going to have a study guide. It's going to have learning objectives. It's going to be evidence-based policing 101 that talks about all these particular things that we're talking about here in terms of principles, and also gives some concrete examples for the entry-level officer. Okay? We would love to hear your input on whether or not it is even useful when you're testing them out in your academies, and we'll be happy to come out and test them out in your academies. But we're going to have this available in a couple of weeks. Okay? We hope to add to this module by other researchers coming and talking about things like police legitimacy, use of force, things like hotspots policing. Chris is going to do one on hotspots policing for the academies. Okay? So this will be available for everybody in a couple of weeks. Okay, and then the second example that I want to give to you is field training. This is a little bit more complex than the academy, than just teaching something. Why? Because field training emphasizes experiential learning. It's about going out in your car and experiencing policing, knowing how to go from different calls and making arrests, etc. So how do we actually incorporate research knowledge into that, right? Well, we started looking at different models of field training to see how we might do this. And what we're finding is that most field training, and we're working with Alexandria Police Department on this, most field training tends to have activities that the field training officer needs to do, and it has performance measures in which an officer is graded on. Okay? So when I was in field training, and my field training officer used to fill out this green sheet every week on my performance, and it was the same green sheet each week, and you did that for 16, 20 weeks. Okay? And that's pretty much how field training happens in many locations. Right? The trick is, though, if you're going to try to incorporate some of these research notions into field training, you still have to give the officer the introductory stuff. But you can scaffold your field training curriculum to include more complex ideas. Let me give some examples. It's just the easiest way is just to give some examples of this. If all of you turn to tab number 2 of your workbooks. Okay. In tab number 2, you can flip through until you hit adjusting existing field training activities and steps to better reflect evidence. Some preliminary ideas. This is a typical title for an academic researcher. It's, I should have just made it more straightforward. But this first graph that you're seeing is where we took all the activities in Alexandria's, what they call their Rook book, which is essentially a standard operating procedure and guidelines for going through field training, different activities that the officers have to hit upon during field training. We took every single one of those activities and we sat down with the field training officers. We went out on ride-alongs with the field training officers and said, how can we convert these in later time periods of field training? So one example that we have is beat checks. And if you go to page 2, Chris, I know I'm over my time. I'm almost done. If you go to page 2, you see beat checks or random patrol. Okay? Does everyone here know what beat checks are? Beat checks are like, it's a very basic skill that officers need to know, whether they're told to go certain places to check on doors or to check on residents, or to look at certain places, or maybe a school's letting out and they need to go and hang out there for a little bit. Beat checks and random patrol are just kind of the everyday aspects of an officer's interaction with their environment. Okay? A very important skill to learn. Okay? But what we thought about was in phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4 of field training, why not teach them about hotspots patrol? Why not teach them how long you stay at hotspots? Teach them about the Cooper curve principle, about the 15 minutes at hotspots, right? Why not teach them about where the hotspots are, okay? And this to me is a scaffolding approach. They know how to do beat checks now, but they also know how to do hotspots patrol, which is like a cousin to beat checks, okay? Another example, assisting other officers in jurisdictions. That's the 2 cells above the beat checks or random patrol. This usually involves, okay, if you've run across your jurisdiction line, you can only go 50 feet or a quarter mile before you have to stop chase. It depends on if it's a misdemeanor or felony. There's standard operating procedures for this, okay? There's also standard operating procedures on working with social services and other agencies that are not the police, okay? Again, these things have to be learned. But a scaffolding approach might take this approach for the 2nd phase or the 3rd phase of field training. Why not focus on, for example, how to deal with crime concentrations that sit on both sides of the border? Okay? Criminal offending does not care that the line right here cuts Alexandria and Washington, D.C., or Arlington and Fairfax. It doesn't care. Okay? And so often you see a lot of hotspots that receive less policing at borders because they're at the border, all right? So a conversion of this traditional lesson in field training might be something like, how do we deal with crime that straddles a border? Or how do we deal with other agencies in order to create a tailored approach to a crime problem? Okay? Like civil remedies at housing complexes that require more than just the police. Okay? I don't have time to go into my 3rd example, but you'll hear about case of places in a minute, so we will skip over that. Another way that we can transform field training is through changing performance measures. And some of these performance measures are, if you look at your workbook and if you keep flipping through, there's another set of pages that are called Assessing Recruit Officer Progression and Performance, some preliminary ideas. Okay, so this is where we took all of the performance measures from Alexandria Police Department and we thought, how can we convert these to better reflect the evidence? Okay, so for example, take motor vehicle operation. Again, does the recruit know how to drive? Do they know how to drive safely? Do they know how to operate their vehicle and all the equipment inside of that vehicle, right? These are common things that a field training officer will be measured on, okay? An adjustment to that, an evidence-based conversion of that might be something like teaching that officer about conditions that lead to accidents more likely than in terms of pursuits than other conditions. And there's quite a bit of research on this, okay? Another evidence-based adjustment to this might be something like, how can we teach officers when not to use their motor vehicles, right? Getting out of your car and doing foot patrol might be just as essential in terms of crime control than using your vehicle for slow patrol in crime hotspots. Okay? Similarly, another example is orientation and geography. This is one of my favorite ones. Officers are asked, do you know where you are? Are you able to get from one point to another quickly? Does anybody want to tell me why that's such an important performance measure? I feel like I'm in my classes with my students. They just look at me. I see some of my students here, so I'm going to start calling on you, Terry. But why is this an important field training performance measure? Because in the old days, it was believed that the faster you got to a call, the more effective you were. We now know that it doesn't matter how fast you get to a call. That's not going to be connected to reducing crime in that beat. Okay? You might not even get to the call in time, the guy's probably gone. Okay? So it takes something like, it takes somebody 22 minutes or something like that on average to call the police after the crime has already occurred. All right? So one idea that we had with this adjusting orientation and geography is instead of grading officers on do they know where they are and do they know how to get from one place to another, how about grade officers on do you know where the crime is? Do you know why some places generate and attract crime more than other places? Do you know why there are certain environmental aspects that are connected to crime generation as opposed to others? Okay? And that is also a cousin. It's an evidence-based cousin to this notion of environment and geography. Okay, I've already gone over 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. Those are just, again, 2 examples of some of the demonstrations that we're doing on how to incorporate research into practice. You can see some of these demonstrations at our Matrix demonstration website. We have a whole website on this. But without further ado, if anybody has questions, if you could just hold on to them for the break. We'll have kind of a working break and take questions then. But I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Christopher Coper. He also helps me co-direct the evidence-based policing research program in the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy and is also one of the PIs on this Matrix demonstration project. He's going to lead the discussion with some of our research policing partners of 2 very exciting demonstrations, Case of Places and the Jacksonville OSS unit. So without further ado, Chris?